I had a few close friends, Peter and O'Brien, and we did a lot of work together. When it was time to graduate, Peter had to move to his home in Lexington, South Carolina, with his family due to his father's job. After we graduated, he completed his move with his family. We were invited to visit Peter at his new house for the weekend, so out of boredom, we decided to go for a hike in the nearby woods and countryside. We found a beautiful scenic river, and it was really peaceful. But we got lost, so we just kept following the river. We couldn't tell which way was up or down, and there was no sign of civilization anywhere. We were worried about finding a phone to call Peter's parents to get us out of there since there was no paved road or street nearby. We arrived at a building that resembled an old church, constructed of aged red bricks, with a dirt driveway and a dirt pathway leading to it. It was heavily overgrown with vegetation, so we decided to enter and observe if there were any people present, and possibly request the use of their telephone to obtain the address of this location. As we approached the dirt parking lot, we observed a few vehicles that appeared to be from the late 1970s or early 1980s. 4 of them were very dirty and rusting, and they had flat or missing tires. All of them were white or had been white, and they were parked in a row side by side. As we drew closer, we could hear gospel music and some singing coming from inside the church. We were relieved to hear people inside, so we entered the church, which appeared to be rather old and run down. As we peeked through the main door to the hall, we saw what we estimated to be a few dozen people, all dressed in neat attire, although they were obviously poor. As we entered, the elderly woman with white hair and horn-rimmed glasses, who was playing the church piano, stopped playing and looked at us without expression. What followed was one that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Everyone in the church ceased singing, laid down their song sheets, and slowly turned their heads to look at us with vacant and unfriendly eyes. Peter said that he was sorry to interrupt, and that he would use his phone to call his family to pick him up. There was a silence in the church, except for the creaking of the wooden pews, and we backed out the door, allowing it to close behind us, and looked at each other in a sinister fear before quietly exiting. We started to make our way up the dirt road when O'Brien pointed out that there weren't any crosses or anything Christian. We looked back and saw that about a dozen people, all men, had come out in front of the church and were watching us carefully. This scared us, and we sprinted up the dirt road for what seemed like an hour and a half. We ended up at a rundown gas station that was like one of those old-fashioned full-service stations. Inside, the shelves were mostly bare and dusty looking, and there was an old tanned guy with a baseball cap reading a book that was ragged and yellowed. He looked up at us and said, "If you're lost, just head back the way you came." So we took a left and headed down the road until we saw a telephone pole. We headed right at it, and it led us to a highway. We thanked him and left quickly. As we were walking down the road, the man he had told us about looked back and saw us. He was standing outside the gas station with his hands folded and just staring at us, wearing a crooked-toothed grin. We were lucky enough to be spotted by a police officer who stopped to help us out. We told them we were lost and gave them Peter's address, and the officer whistled at us to let them know we were really lost. It took about half an hour for the officer to give us a ride back to Peter's, and during the chat he warned us to be careful in the woods because there were some crazy witchy people around. I was staying with my grandmother for a weekend while she was away with some church friends in Florida. I was sleeping in the guest bedroom, which had 2 twin beds that my brother and I would use when we had sleepovers at her house. I took the bed closest to the window, but before I went to bed, I checked all the doors to make sure they were locked. When I did go to bed, it was early, and I did not fall asleep for a while. I was on my phone for an hour, watching videos and texting people, when I thought I heard a woman's voice outside. I left the bedroom, slowly approaching the front door to listen. As I approached the front door, I noticed that the sound was coming from the direction of my grandmother's door, which does not have any people. However, the windows in the dining room provided a good view of the porch, so I approached the window to try and get a better look at who was outside. I attempted to peek my head between the plastic blinds without being too obvious. However, I guess I was not successful, as when I looked up, I saw a woman on my grandmother's stoop. She was looking directly at me, as if she had anticipated my presence. She greeted me with a wild smile. This woman was in her late 50s or early 60s, but she did not appear to be an innocent-looking young woman. Something about her appearance drew my attention, and I moved away from the window. thinking it was one of my grandmother's friends. It was midnight, and why would someone come to the door without knocking or ringing the bell? Why was she simply standing there, saying hello repeatedly? I was genuinely concerned. I returned to the guest bedroom and closed the door, but the door was still shut. I could no longer hear the woman, and I began to wonder who she was and where she had gone. I began to text everyone about it, my sister, my friends, and my grandmother, telling them how strange it was. After a considerable period of time in silence, I began to relax. My sisters told me to call my grandma, but there was no way she'd be awake, and she rarely checked her phone anyway. Then something rumbled at the window. No knocking or tapping, just banging. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as my body went into full-on panic. Then the banging stopped, and I heard a familiar voice saying hello with a rush of adrenaline. I must have had the extra courage to pull the blinds up and find myself face to face with a scary old lady wearing a thin layer of glass. I yelled at her and said I was calling the cops. Pulling the blind back down, I ran back out to the living room and looked all around the house. I ran upstairs to box myself in the upstairs guest bedroom. I didn't want to call the cops. I don't know why, I just wanted to wait it out. I crawled into bed in the upstairs guest bedroom and I snuggled under the covers. A couple of hours later, I was still awake. I went back downstairs to look outside each window. The old lady seemed to have disappeared. The next morning, I called my grandmother and told her what happened. She started yelling into the phone, clearly panicking and upset. She told me that a few days ago she was being followed in the grocery store by a woman about 10 years younger than her who was just staring at her. I told her to calm down. I wasn't sure whether to connect it or not, but when we finally hung up the phone, I had to think about it. My grandmother is 75 years old and has lost a lot of her sense of humor, so I take some of the things she says with a pinch of salt. But the way she was yelling into the phone about the woman at the store gave me chills, and I'm still wondering if it could be the same person. I used to be a construction worker and engineer in the Ohio when I was in my mid-20s. We'd do basic jobs like building add-ons to existing structures, like basements. In 2010, we were working on a small basement area and extending the main floor of a coroner's dentist's building. We were making great progress, and by the time we got to the end of the story, the basement had working lights, and the hole in the ground was sealed off. Since the lights were still working down there, we had a light source. During the night, one of my co-workers, Alan, would go up and then out to help with the work on the extra section outside. I was playing around with the electrical components, not being an electrician, but having a basic knowledge of the process. However, when the power went out, I became aware that it was not related to what I was doing. I assumed that there had been a power outage in the vicinity. The four of us had not kept our cell phones with us due to the nature of our jobs and the dirtiness of our hands. We all kept them in our jackets that were hung upstairs. However, one of the tools that we kept in our vests was a flashlight. Before I could reach for my flashlight, I began to hear a rattling sound, which was not quite the same as a bag of coins being shaken, but close enough to make it sound like it was coming from inside the small bathroom. I pulled my flashlight out of the pouch on my vest, turned it on, and pointed it towards the bathroom area, where we had already put up a door. It was a bit closed, so it blocked my view from the room itself, but it didn't sound like any kind of infrastructure, so I had to think it was one of my co-workers. As I approached the door, my flashlight revealed a person dressed in black standing in the corner of the small room. I was unable to make out their face until the person's head turned as if they were reacting to a noise in the woods. All I could see was the glint in their eyes. I waited a second before opening the door, needing to regain my bearings. As soon as I did, the door slammed shut, and I ran upstairs in my heavy boots, searching for my colleagues. They were all outside, probably ready to close up for the night due to the power outage in the nearby buildings. I counted 3 people in the room, so it could not have been any of them. I inquired if anyone else who worked in the building was present that night, and they all informed me that no one had been present. At this point, I had to take them down the stairs to demonstrate the strange stranger in the basement. They followed me to the basement and to the small room, and as I had feared, the person I had seen was no longer in the basement or in the entire basement. I was understandably embarrassed when they did not believe me, but I did not want to hold them hostage and force them to believe me. We all returned outside to pack our belongings, and as I was the key holder to the building, I was required to lock the door when everyone left. After getting into my vehicle and watching the others drive away, I cannot describe it. But I had a feeling in my gut that made me want to go down into that basement and look again for the person I was sure I saw. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door to the building, and went down to the basement. The power was too loud, so I went down the stairs with 2 flashlights on my phone and 1 on my phone. I made it to the bottom step and then stopped. The dead silence in this small, unfinished basement, combined with the fact that I was expecting a sound, scared me to the point where I was about to turn around and go back up the stairs when I heard rattling coming from the small room again. I didn't even look, and when I heard the sound, I felt my heart skip a beat. So I ran upstairs, slammed the basement door shut again, locked it to the building, and drove home. Thank God it was a Saturday, so I didn't have to go back until Monday. I made sure never to work in the basement alone again, but thankfully we completed the work in a couple of weeks, and nothing strange happened again.